for having me here. As been introduced, my name is Solip Park. I am a doctoral student at Aalto University School of Arts, Design and Architecture here in Finland. Today I would like to talk about my master thesis, which I defended back in December 2019. The original title of this thesis was Display the Gameplay but Playfully, which talks about the game museum cases in South Korea and Finland. And my thesis supervisor was Professor Mira Kalliotaven. And the thesis was awarded as the best game-related master thesis in 2020 by Finnish Game Research Society. So let's get into this. So my master thesis discusses the game museum's display choices through risk perspective comparative research between game museum in my home country, South Korea, and my current country, Finland. And I did this by combining the method of visual discourse analysis and comic-based research, which I will get back to the methods later in this presentation while I discuss the findings. Oops. The research participants were Nexon Computer Museum, Nexon Komputerbak물관 in Korean, aka NCM, located in Jeju Island in South Korea. And on the right side, the Finnish Museum of Games, Suomen Pelimuseo in Finnish, aka FMG, located in Tampere, Finland. I've noticed several panels already mentioned these two institutions already during this conference, which is awesome. I also used to work at NCM from 2020 till 2015 until I came to Finland. And it was the place where I first found my passion for academic research on games, and now it became a research participant in my master thesis, which was double the happiness that I did. Also to note, I'm also the amateur game comic artist, which definitely affected my choices of research methods in this thesis. So the story starts is when I first visited FMG, the Finnish Museum of Games in 2017, I was genuinely surprised how much the same artifacts or similar historical events are displayed differently, slightly in a different manner from the game museum that I experienced back in South Korea. And at the time of this master's thesis, I wasn't able to find much of a comparative analysis between displays of game museum between East and West. So I decided to fill this gap by exploring how and why these two game museums tend to interpret similar historical events. I also wanted to implement comic making as part of the research tool, a very artistic research method, I would say, and just to explore my artistic accomplishment at the time. So the research questions were, one is how do FMG and NCM display games differently in the museum space? How do curators and potential museum visitors gaming memories related to the choices of objects and aesthetics of these two institutions? And lastly, how can comics as a research tool can able to supplement the study? But before I start, I would also like to mention that what I mean by game museum curators at the time of this master thesis, and still quite much similar until now, is that game museum curators are most likely the founding members of the game museum itself. This patterns of curators equals founding member is quite common around game museum around the world, including the cases of NCM FMGs, but they're not isolated cases. It's quite common around game museums that I currently know of. Like I mentioned, this master thesis is structured in two phases. One is the visual discourse analysis, which visual data, notes, naturally occurring data from the museum site while interacting with the curators. Here I concentrated on how things are being shown and being said through those visuals. And then the second phase is the comic-based research using the comic making process as an inductive data elicitation. The goal was to illustrate the findings, and along the way, while doing so, discovering the new meanings and other new meanings, while investigating more of the cases of the potential visitors who haven't visited the game museums yet, but reading the comics. So let's also try to compare how they feel about game museums while also research about game curators. So I'll go to the first phase, the visual discourse. After categorizing visuals and notes gathered from entire museums, Just to let you know, these museums are quite huge, especially the one in Korea. They have 4-floor high building just dedicated for this museum itself. I photograph all of them and then categorize them and narrow down into 3 comparative dimensions to match to the scope of this thesis. The first dimension was about the display technique of the game Pong. I'm sure many of us knows what the game Pong is about, so I won't go too much into this detail. In Nexon Computer Museum in South Korea, which you can see on the left, Pong is displayed with a replicated form. And at the time of this thesis, the curators of NCM explained that the game Pong never actually reached to South Korea in the 1970s or 80s, early 80s. And curators themselves also had no previous experience of playing Pong or have associated with any of this with South Korean computer game history at the time. The game Pong is, however, is displayed in NCM as one of the most monumental figures of the global video game industry. And on the display of the Pong in the Finnish Museum of Games on the right side, as you can see, it's displayed in very bright, cozy atmosphere surrounded by Christmas decorations. The Finnish curators at the time described that this choice of the display of Pong, as well as the decoration, is due to its relevancy with the local Finnish game history. Pong was one of the first digital games to reach regular household in Finland at the time. Many people played it, and curators that also describe this exhibit of Pong is very Finnish in how the surrounding decorations, especially of this Pong exhibit, is authentically reconstructing their memories of Finnish household in the 1980s. The second dimension is how these 2 museum institutions portrays the topic of the origin of modern games. This is about which artifact that they chose as the first, original, the oldest history within the game museum narrative. Again, 2 game museums showed significantly interesting different interpretation tactics. The case on the NCM in South Korea, again on the left, the Apple I computer from 1976 is displayed as the origin of modern games. This is the original functional Apple I computer that is not the oldest, but one of the oldest and the most precious and obviously the most expensive artifact preserved in this institution. Again, like in the case of game Pong, this computer never actually reached to South Korea in the 1970s. But it is, again, preserved and displayed at a monumental figure of not only the computer history, but global video game industry, calling this as a general purpose computer that sparks the inspirations that led to video game history. So you can kind of see the narrative here. I also want to give an add here that the restored version of the Kingdom of the Winds, which was presented by Lee Jung-yup earlier today, is also displayed in NCM right in the same exhibition floor. While this Apple I is displayed at the origin of the modern games of the world and placed in the beginning of the exhibition, the Kingdom of the Winds, the restored version, the game that was its very historical monumental figure in Korean history, is displayed at the end of the exhibition hall as the origin of the modern Korean game. So there were kind of like 2 narratives that structured together within this exhibition area. The curation of the Finnish Museum of Game took opposite approach and focused on emphasizing the locality, again, the national identities of Finnish games. This reflected on their choice of board game Lustfall to Avasaksa, the journey from Lustfall to Avasaksa, which was also introduced during this conference 2 days ago by Nicholas and Jakob. The message here that is artifact portrays, again, the narrative that games were here with us in Finland and people in Finland enjoyed the game. So it's very similar narrative coming from Pong as well. Finally, I explored how these 2 institutions portray the timeline of video game console generation. As many of you know, this is a generation that is kind of like categorized based on the performances of video game console, widely known, especially in the North America video game context, and as well as Japanese. In the case of Korea, it is part of the museum that probably has the strongest emphasis on the domestic element compared to 2 other dimensions. The entire wall is displayed on video game console chronologically right to left, including American and Japanese video game consoles, but also game purpose IBM clone computers that was developed in Korea in 1980s. Then the opposite side of that wall is dedicated with Korean game magazines that was published from 80s to 90s. Some of the consoles are available to play freely by the visitors with 3 to 5, 6 playable console cartridges per generation. So people can choose which game they can play with. And the curators in NCM explained that although the display console's chronological order is based on the historical record, the wall's aesthetical decoration and its choices of playable cartridges are primarily based on their pre-knowledge, sometimes childhood gameplay memories, or his or her gameplay experiences. For the Finnish Museum of Games, the video game console generation here are displayed on the wall of their multi-purpose area. Here, the video game consoles were more of a decorative aesthetic figure than the historical display. The curators described this exhibition as, because this console is not technically directly relevant to the Finnish game history. They were not necessarily relevant in the Finnish game history at the time. Maybe they didn't got imported in Finland at the time, or wasn't a significant historical figure, maybe or so. This is a contrast with the one in Korea, obviously, where if you remember, Pong and the Apple I computers, that the machine that were not imported to Korea still displayed it as one of the most monumental artifacts of the museum. So you can see the patterns here, that game history, this topic, historical events and topic, can be interpreted differently per game museum, per their narrative. So I looked deep into why this is so different by diving deeper into especially the dialogue and retrospective data gathered from the curators and text, that the social political context, domestic social political context during the Games Museum established may hold a key to curatorial choices of objects. In 2012, a year before NCM, the Nexon Computer Museum's grand open, Korean government had listed video game as one of the evil axes and passed the legislation of the shutdown law. So the law definitely didn't impact the museum itself, but the growing criticism of game, especially the domestic online game, definitely impacted their strategies, their narrative. And so the strategy was to display the history of games, and more specifically the history of Korean games, within the larger context of global computer history. And they technically branded themselves also as a computer museum, despite the majority of the artifacts are video games. The one in Finland, Finnish Museum Games, on the other hand, focused on the history of Finnish game, which is also kind of directed through what are the private collectors that involved in this museum was wanting to hope for. But it's also very important to notice that the museum was founded when Finland was celebrating 100 anniversaries of their independence from Russia. And that celebration was happening just around the time in 2017 when this museum was on plan. Although the museum was not directly associated with this national celebration, but the curators generally agreed that emerging national discourses certainly positively influenced their museum narrative. Secondly, the curators of gameplay nostalgia of the curators definitely influenced the choices of aesthetics. This is where this artistic freedom of the curators of this game museum stood out. Curators in Korea were motivated to select playable concept cartridges in their video game console timeline exhibition by reference their memories and preferences. The curators in the Finnish Museum of Games were similarly that their aesthetics were driven by the ideas of their own ideas and how they remember those games used to be played in the Finnish household by friends back in those days. And that definitely impacted their aesthetics choices. So it seems all evident that curators are key components of this game museum. They're self-motivated individuals who actively choose objects according to museum's core social political orientation, and will not hesitate to bring their own game history, gameplay memories alive into the aesthetic of the museum. Then second phase, I moved to the comic-based research phase. This is very artistic, exploratorial things, where I both written and illustrated the comic myself and published through online channels. Just to let you know, comic-based research is one of the art-based research methodologies, which is transdisciplinary approach to combine the creative arts in research contexts. And comic-based research are obviously the research method that use comic making as one of the methods. The way I implemented comic making within this thesis was illustrating the image. As you can see on the right side of the image, first visual data, notes, naturally occurring data from the museum was categorized and analyzed already in the phase one. And I started to illustrate those, making scenes and cuts and making the characters fitting inside the text and the text bubbles, compositioning. And while doing so, it gradually kind of helped me to reflect and revisit the data. This comic was titled A Brief History of Digital Play, where it was published from January until August 2018 on a bi-weekly basis. Again, I also wrote and illustrated the entire comic myself. Some of the episodes were actually reflected from the reader's comment, which enabled this like participatory interactions with me, also with the readers. The viewers of this comic were relatively very high motivated in visuals, as it turned out. They weren't expected to read this comic about this museum, but they gradually hopped onto it. And many sent comments about their local game history, how gameplay memories and nostalgia as well. And one of the good examples is when the viewer from Slovakia introduced how the word game means in their own language and how it is referred to in their cultural context. Many viewers also did similar things, and they also kind of mentioned like which game that was they found very interesting and have like they played in overnight. So yeah, this is the conclusion part. I mean, like I said, like I forgot to mention this on this comic-based research that this active interactions of these potential visitors, the readers of the comic, is not new. Is actually very similar to what game curators was engaging with their own game history in the museum itself. So the conclusion is the first, game museums are inseparable from how game is perceived in the domestic social political context. Obviously, the game museum has a narrative, and that narrative is influenced by the external factors as well. And then both curators and visitors of the game museums were self-motivated to the topic of game history, actively associating the game museum with their gameplay memories. Both have the similar motivations of wanting games to be displayed lively, as they were from their memories, how they tend to shape their own memories, aka display the gameplay, but playfully, of how they tend to shape and remembers the game back in those days. They wanted to be displayed as an history, but also playful at the time, which became literally the title of my thesis, Display the Gameplay, but Playfully. And additionally, they were obviously appealing to the potential visitors. Both NCM and FMG do display games as they how it used to be and how people expect to be for now. And comic making was quite of an effective way for me to gather insights about the museum contents and engaging with the people about the contents of the game museum before they even visited the museum itself. So like interaction with the potential visitor was quite nice. And for myself as an artistic researcher, I also find the comic making as a quite effective way for me to elicitate the data. So yeah, my master thesis ended with these open questions that will game museums able to continue to be playful? They obviously exceed the expectations of the current generation, current game fans, who portrays the game history in a very personal manner, in a sense, self-motivated. But again, would the future generations now enjoying a completely new type of gaming platform would have the same nostalgia associated with the gameplay displayed in game museum? If so, would game museum be able to continue to iterate, revise, and update it themselves? I will leave these questions open for our audiences. And a final remark, after this master thesis, I'm now a doctoral student in Aalto, exploring how game making practices tend to be interpreted. So I started with how game museum interpret the game history, and now I move on to how game making people, game creators tend to interpret themselves. So yeah, that was my final presentation. And finally, lastly, I want to send great thanks to curators of Nexon Computer Museum, Cheuna Usangon, and also the curators of Finnish Museum of Games, Nicholas Nyland and Mikko Heinonen, as I wouldn't be able to come this far without their help, dedication, and support. Thank you very much for my presentation.
Okay.